the Chancellor, Professor Alan Finkel, the new Vice Chancellor, Professor Margaret Gardner, and the Pro Vice Chancellor, Professor David Koploff. Really love that you guys made an effort to come down. The club really supports it. Before moving on, I guess, to the actual debate, just wanted to say a couple of housekeeping things. So we've rigged up a couple of new techie sort of stuff that I'm not quite familiar with, but we've got the appropriate people running it. So we've got a Twitter feed up with the hashtag MonashPD. Any sort of witty, funny, or just any comment you want to make, please post it up. We'll have a running slide of the most interesting and quirky tweets that have occurred after each speaker. We're also trialling a new interactive poll process, so you should have seen up on the slide what we've got going on. We've had people send through text. So basically what we're going to do is you can text through the keyword allowed to support the affirmative team, or text through the keyword banned to support the negative team to the number that will be displayed on the screen. I'm not sure if we've already got the results slowly streaming in. It's working, guys, our technology. So that's where we're at. We're gonna redo this poll at the end of the debate to see whether any of these wonderful speakers have changed your mind. That will be conducted during the Q&A session, which happens at the end of this debate. So like I said, so people's texting, it works. It's proof it works. So like I said, thank you so much for coming along. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Gardner to begin the debate.
Well, thank you, Shara, Chancellor, distinguished guests of the panel and wonderful audience, and it's very pleasing to be here, to have this opportunity to be here at this debate, to see this wonderful society in action. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet here on the lands of the people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. In preparation for this evening, I had a look at the previous Vice-Chancellor's public debates, debates on the carbon price, the Arab Spring, perceived decline in standards of political discourse, a perennial favourite. They've not shied away from any of the controversial issues of the day, and tonight is no exception. These are always issues that elicit strong passions. They're subjects that, as universities who have a role as intellectual leaders in the community, should appropriately address. And although we are still subject to the tyranny of the SMS, I think that might be the only social media tyranny that's working up here at the moment. But universities provide a space for people to make a contribution to debate. Hopefully to make a very meaningful contribution to debate around the great issues of our time. Because it is in these institutions formed on Enlightenment values that we expect to get the quality of rational debate that takes us forward. I hope that this evening's event continues that tradition. I am sure that that is what the student society is deeply committed to, and it's great to see that it's so active. The limits that we as a society place on freedom of expression have always been a topic of heated discussion and, of course, most recently, very heated discussion, attracting comment from a wide range of quarters. Some of this evening's speakers, as people will be aware, have been active participants in that discussion, and they have made signal contributions, and people have felt one way or another about them, usually passionately. Freedom of expression is arguably one of the most fundamental of our political rights. How can any decision be said to be democratic unless the full range of views have been canvassed and the most compelling arguments put forward, and may I say, picked apart? But fundamental, of course, doesn't just mean unfettered. We routinely, and for the most part uncontroversially, accept that there are limits to what may be said, particularly in cases where expression conflicts with another fundamental value. It's just that we don't all agree on exactly what those limits and fundamental values are. Free speech does not, in the famed words of Oliver Wendell Holmes, equate to the right to falsely shout fire in a crowded theatre. Such a telling expression in the current circumstances. It does not extend to the right to perjure oneself or defame another, to divulge confidential information, or to infringe legitimate copyright. Or it typically doesn't, though at various times we get debates over almost all of those things. The question before this House tonight is whether we should allow speech that offends and insults. It's a big question. On the one hand, as institutions committed to intellectual inquiry, universities should, and largely do, I believe, boast a culture of free, open and robust discussion. On the other hand, universities are places of tolerance. We expect a degree of politeness in our debates. We unapologetically forbid speech that threatens in some way or appears to harm segments of our community. The Student Charter of Monash University makes it clear that no student may harass, vilify, threaten or intimidate others. And that particular rule raises many interesting questions, and one of the interesting questions that will be investigated this evening. By creating a space, and that's what universities are, just a wonderful space, where people can share their opinions without fear. Do we, as we would like to believe, improve the quality of the debate? And how do we ensure that the sharing of opinions without fear is done in such a way that it will improve the quality of the debate? There are other questions. Are some classes of insult or offence as harmful to people's well-being as other forms of assault? If so, would they be prescribed? Is sunlight, as Louis Brandeis argued, the best disinfectant? Or can it encourage things that we would rather not see the light of day to spread? So, we have a very impressive slate of speakers tonight. Very impressive. And I look forward to the fact that they have to answer these questions and not I. I look forward to the fact that my last encounter with debating was in high school, which is a depressingly long time ago. So, let me begin by introducing this debate and the speakers. To open the debate for the affirmative, we have Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, Mr. Tim Wilson. As Commissioner, Mr. Wilson is focused on promoting and advancing traditional human rights and freedoms, including free speech, freedom of association, worship, movement and property rights. He worked formerly in trade and communication consulting, international aid and development and politics. He is, as you will find as we move through this distinguished panel, a distinguished alumnus of Monash University with a Bachelor of Arts Policy and a Masters of Diplomacy and Trade, International Trade from this wonderful university. He was also, in his time here, I am reliably informed, an active and influential student leader, including a number of years as leader of the Student Union at the Caulfield campus that even I, here in the early stages of my third week, know is called Monsu. Ladies and gentlemen, to affirm the proposition that we should allow speech that offends and insults, Mr. Tim Wilson.
Well, thank you very much, Vice Chancellor, but I need to start by saying that Holmes was wrong. Fire! It shows you that the detail matters. You can get away with it when there actually is one, or if you're trying to crack a very bad joke. Thank you everybody for being here this afternoon. As introduced, my name is Tim Wilson, and we are here to debate a very important topic, that we would allow speech that offends or insults. And today, as part of my wonderful team in the affirmative, we have myself, Australia's Human Rights Commissioner. If anybody knows what free speech is, well, I guess it's probably me. Ready to go straight over. The wonderful Jane Dixon, and the equally wonderful and equally authoritative with Jane on free speech, and myself, Chris Berg from the Institute of Public Affairs. And when it comes down to it, we should allow for speech that offends or insults. In fact, to suggest otherwise is not actually to understand the root principles of our liberal democracy and how it is formed. All speech is legal until it is made explicitly illegal. So the question should be why we should be restricting it. In fact, the propositions start from the very basis of our society and what we believe in. And we shouldn't restrict speech on the basis of offence and insults because it is a subjective test. In fact, we just heard from the Vice-Chancellor herself about the restrictions that are placed on speech on a university campus. Speech that threatens, which threatens people's personal security. Harassment, which is equally a form of threatening of people's personal security. But we do not have the very same standards that operate on this university campus because something like offence and insult is subjective. It's based on how people receive information, not necessarily on how people communicate it. The current Liberal Democratic Senator for New South Wales, David Leyonhjelm, correctly points out that people take offence. It is impossible to give it because the basis and the information that amounts to people taking offence varies from person to person, based on their life experiences, based on ideas about what they value or what other people do not. Equally, the importance of speech that may offend or insult is very difficult to ascertain before you actually communicate it. And to give another very clear example from this university, there is a whole subject taught, at least it used to be at the Caulfield campus, called cross-cultural communication. Cross-cultural communication is taught to people to avoid offence and insult because it's so hard to establish where the line sits. It's based on individual circumstances. You need to be culturally aware and be aware of the situation that individuals face themselves so you don't go to the point of saying something outrageous or offensive. But more to the point, we should be allowing offence and insulting language because we believe in free speech. When it comes down to it, if you don't believe in being able to offend or insult somebody, then you do not believe in free speech at all. Because it is only the types of speech that offend or insult that justifies you invoking this important principle that sits at the heart of our liberal democracy. We are never called in to defend free speech because of the excessive use of please and thank you. It's only when it triggers these sorts of parameters that we have to run in and defend this important principle and this important point. Now, the other team will argue, of course, that the principle of sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. And that's partly true. There is words that can amount to having a physical harm. This is not in dispute, which is why we have provisions around harassment. It's why we also restrict speech that may be on the basis of incitement to violence. This standard simply doesn't meet that test. And so as a consequence, we cannot restrict speech on that basis. And of course, it comes in the context of the recent discussion around the Racial Discrimination Act. Everybody here opposes racism, or at least I hope you do, as enlightened individuals. But it doesn't amount to justifying the types of restrictions that we're proposing, the other team are defending and are proposing today. Because when it comes down to it, it's a standard that simply cannot be consistently applied. We do not have equivalent provisions around offensive or insulting speech for things like sexism, misogyny, homophobia, attacks on people on the basis of disability, simply because the speech may offend or insult somebody. And if we did, we would have rightly outrage within the community. It would directly limit the rights of other people to express their views on matters that are personal and often moral or religious. Take, for example, issues around homosexuality, where it's often preached by people, religious practitioners, offensive or insulting opinions on the basis of what they deem to be the immorality of homosexuality. Similar attitudes are often communicated about women. Does it make it right? No. But should we be free to express our contempt and our negative attitude towards people who have those values or have that negative cultural attitude? The answer is yes. That's why we cannot restrict speech. Because if we do, we actually limit our own capacity to attack other types of unjust prejudice that exist within our society. And as Commissioner responsible for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex affairs, this is a big challenge for somebody like myself, because culturally ingrained homophobia in the community is real, yet you cannot call it out without falling foul of provisions and restrictions which say that you cannot offend, insult or humiliate people on the basis of their race. And to put that in perspective, humiliation is also an important part of that discussion, because humiliation over homosexuality sits at the heart of why there are honour killings in some cultures. This is how deeply challenging some of these issues are, and they're very important to be able to be free to open and discuss them. Equally, we have a federal parliament that has the legislative power to create laws specifically about issues like matters of race. I come from a simple proposition that if we are able to legislate for it, we must be able to speak about it. We must be able to debate it. We must be able to say things we wish, even if they are contemptible, and for them to be responded to exactly as the Vice-Chancellor outlined, with the sunlight of ideas as the best form of disinfectant. It also assumes, of course, that this process, that anything that is insulting or offensive is necessarily unjustified. Yet history shows otherwise. Of course, Galileo offended people as the inventor of the telescope and put forward the simple idea that the Earth revolved around the sun. This offended many people at the time, including those in positions of power and authority, because offensive and insulting speech is often used to tackle and to directly respond to the authority of those who are in positions of power and the need to challenge them and their ideas so that we can continue to evolve as part of a broader human progress. Similarly, Jon Snow, he is a hero of the public health movement. Have I missed something?
Yes. Game of Thrones.
Oh, sorry. I'm not talking about the Jon Snow from Game of Thrones. Typical university student audience. Far too much time watching television, not enough time studying history. Hero of the public health movement. Discovered that cholera was caused and spread as a consequence of the association of contaminated water. This directly offended the scientific establishment of the day, to the point where they were directly challenged with their ideas about germ theory and the idea that cholera was spread through air. Yet this was rejected, this very simple principle of the foundations of modern epidemiology, by the Lancet journal, which is one of the world's preeminent publications on the basis of scientific research. You have to be able to engage in insulting or offensive behaviour to be able to challenge authority. There must always be a gap between what is socially acceptable and the law. And there's a very simple principle for that, because we have to be able to continue to discuss, to evolve, to challenge ideas at the heart of our society. If we did not, and we established a similar sort of principle in different stages of history, society would have stagnated. From the discussions, the points I just made with relation to your favourite Game of Thrones hero, all the way through to issues around tackling patriarchy, homophobia and misogyny in our communities through up until, or that still exist often today, but certainly that exists entrenched in terms of our society through to the middle of the 20th century. The assumption also behind making speech that is offensive or illegal, offensive or insulting illegal, is that we don't have other ways to tackle it. Not only can people use their speech to stand up, speak out and call out behaviour that they find unacceptable, but we have non-legislative ways to manage those challenges as well. If you go and participate in sporting clubs, they have sporting codes which restrict and limit the terms and conditions which people can participate in sporting clubs, where you can't go around and harass people or vilify people, and sometimes even just as low as established standards like insult and offence on a sporting match. Of course, you're welcome to do it, but you can no longer participate in that sport. That is a way of preserving and protecting free speech, while also making sure that we have societal norms that establish acceptable behaviour as part of this discussion. Is that the end, or is that 1 minute? That's it. So I will hand it over to the tragic opponents who want to somehow limit what we can say, and I think I may have already just invoked the principle of insulting and offending them in the process. Thank you.
thank you, Tim, and I'm glad to see that you recognised it was a student audience. And in fact, I guess we could be pleased that we haven't got someone standing on the wall and dealing with issues by hacking them to death, rather than in this way. It's now my pleasure to introduce the first speaker for the negative, Mr. Michael Gawenda. Michael Gawenda, also an alumnus of Monash University, is one of Australia's best-known journalists and authors in a journalism career spanning many decades. He's been a political reporter, a foreign correspondent based in London and Washington, a columnist, a feature writer and editor of The Age. He's won 3 Walkley Awards. He was the inaugural director of the Centre for Advancing Journalism at the University of Melbourne, where he's now an honorary senior research fellow. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Michael Gawenda.
Well, thank you, Vice Chancellor. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I must say that it's been probably a half a century or more since I've taken part in a debate. So if you find me a little nervous or stumbling, please forgive me. I'm not going to talk about Section 18C. And the reason that I'm not going to talk about it is because there is no chance in the foreseeable future that there will be any change to Section 18C. It's off the agenda for this government, and I believe it's off the agenda for any government in the foreseeable future. Of course, our opponents on the other side are going to continue to bang on about Section 18C. Tim, who I admire in many ways, has failed in his essential task when he was appointed Freedom Commissioner, and that was to get this section of the legislation removed. Well, you failed. I don't know whether that means you should resign, but I do think it's a question that you ought to consider. Why did it fail? It failed basically because, not because the government's handling of it was pathetic, which is true, but it failed basically because out in the community, in general, there is no sense that people feel like their freedom of speech is being restricted. Most people don't feel as if they're carrying the burden of being careful of what they say, because if they say something wrong, they will be dragged before the federal court or dragged into some sort of process that could end up with them being in jail. They don't feel that way, and the truth is that for the vast majority of people, that's not the case. In fact, no one's been jailed as far as I know. I don't know whether Frederick Tobin was in danger of being jailed because he was in contempt of a decision by the federal court. But the fact is that most people didn't consider this an important issue because they didn't feel that it impacted on them. And in fact, it didn't impact on them. The people that were most vociferously opposed to any change to Section 18C were people who had experience of what it felt like to be the victims of insulting and offending speech, and what it did to them in terms of the sense of how safe they felt in the society in which they lived, the effect that they felt it might have on their children and on their children's future. And for me, that was the main reason why all the ethnic community leaders in this country were so opposed to any change to Section 18C. And that's why, in the end, the section wasn't removed, wasn't changed, and won't be changed in the future. So I actually see no point. My distinguished fellow speakers might actually deal with Section 18C, but I'm not going to. So I want to have a look at the topic. I know that the topic is about whether we should allow speech that offends or insults. The question is, who and what is the we are talking about? If you get my meaning, what's more, what do we mean by allow? Those two questions seem to me to be fundamentally important. I'll try and answer these questions shortly. But first, the topic seems to suggest, if you just read it as a statement, that speech that offends and insults and is directed at virtually any group or individual in the community should be allowed or disallowed. Now, this is an absurd proposition. We're not talking about speech that offends anyone. Do we mean to include politicians, for instance, in terms of banning speech or not allowing speech that offends or insults politicians? Do we mean certain celebrities of various kinds? Do we mean writers? Do we mean film directors? Do we mean philosophers? People at a dinner party? Do we mean a group of people having more than a few drinks in the pub and that might say things that someone mightn't like in the group? Well, obviously that's an absurd proposition. That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about everybody, and we're not talking about speech that offends and insults to everybody in the community. If we did, of course, include politicians, for instance, we'd be marching down the path towards some form of totalitarianism, and no one would support that. And we don't support that either, even though we have a very distinguished politician on our side of the act. So let's go back to the we issue. I believe that the we in the proposition being debated should be defined as us, all of us, we. We as a community and those of us who represent or have leadership positions in a variety of community institutions and organisations. In all our community institutions and organisations. The Vice Chancellor talked about the university has certain rules about how students relate to each other. It's not just about intimidation or vilification. It's about how we treat each other in terms of speech that might make people feel unsafe. Now, I want to say it's interesting that in this proposition we don't have intimidation included. But for certain people, for certain groups in our society, to insult them or to offend them is to intimidate them. Racist comments, for instance, that are insulting, that are obviously insulting, are also by their very nature intimidatory. There's no doubt that people who are the subject of racist abuse language, where you're not saying the person is saying, I'm going to kill you, or I'm going to get you, I'm going to hurt you anyway, you feel intimidated because you feel unsafe. You feel unable to answer the insult. It diminishes you as a person and makes you feel like you're powerless. To me, that's a form of intimidation. So I want to go back to this sense of we. Who are we? We are individuals in the society, and we are institutions and members of institutions. And as individuals and within these institutions, we all set standards. We set standards for ourselves in terms of how we're going to conduct our public discourse and our discourse within the institutions of which we are members. It means that we accept certain things about certain groups in our community that they need to be protected. And they need to be protected in the sense that there's certain things that you can't say about them on the basis of their race, of their sexuality, and of their gender. Because those things, if you say those things, you produce an unsafe environment. Those standards that we set in large part involve protecting those members in the community who are vulnerable to attack, not on the basis of what they say or do, but on the basis of the group that they belong to, and that they belong to not by choice but by accidents of birth. These standards are there to protect people who are rendered powerless, intimidated, in other words, by insults and offensive language to which there can't be any rational reply. Now, I have to admit that I argued publicly for the repeal of Section 18C. I argued for the repeal of that section on the basis that I was a journalist, and journalists ought to be arguing for as much freedom as is possible in a community like ours. I even thought that it was a mistake that Andrew Bob was the subject of court proceedings. I thought his journalism was poor. I thought the articles were poorly framed. I thought the tone of the articles was appalling, and there were many, many factual errors in his articles. But I don't believe it's up to a judge or a court to decide what is good journalism and what is poor journalism. Nevertheless, I think Andrew Bolt shouldn't have been subject to court proceedings, and I believe that even that disgusting Holocaust denier Frederick Tobin shouldn't have been subjected to court proceedings. I do not believe that laws, judges and lawyers should be involved in setting the limits of free speech. But none of this is to say that when I was editor of The Age, for instance, I ever doubted that it was my duty, not just my right, but my duty to refuse space to the Tobins of this world and to others whose views were clearly racist or homophobic or misogynistic. I was a censor. I was a supporter of free speech, and yet in my role as an editor of a newspaper, I rejected hundreds of articles, and thousands of letters that I refused to publish in my newspaper, in the newspaper that I edited, because I believe that we, that is, the we that I'm talking about, the institution that I represented and the community of readers that institution served, had every right, duty to refuse a platform to those who would offend and insult and therefore intimidate people, making them feel unsafe on the basis of their race, of their ethnicity, their sexuality or their gender. So it is a ridiculous, we're in a situation where it's obviously clear that we are in the business as a community of restricting free speech. We are in the position where we do deny people the right to insult and offend certain people, and long may that continue.
Thank you, Mr. Gawenda. It's now my pleasure to call upon the second. I don't get to read these; they're all gone by the time I sit down. It's now my pleasure to call upon the second speaker for the affirmative, Ms. Jane Dixon. Jane Dixon, SC, has practised at the Victorian Bar for over 20 years. She's participated in a number of cases with strong human rights focus and has been retained by Public Interest Law Clearinghouse for a variety of matters, including an anti-discrimination case dealing with issues of religious vilification. Ms. Dixon is Chair of the Pro Bono Committee of the Victorian Bar, a past recipient of Women's Lawyers Achievement Award and a Victorian Bar Pro Bono Scheme Award. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Jane Dixon.
And Shara over there will censor my free speech when I speak too long. I'll count myself as the third speaker for the affirmative, so I thank Mr. Gawenda for assisting our cause. He has indicated that we don't need to worry about those trifling cases that won't get to court. I'm not so sure about that. I acted for a client whose main sin was walking around the middle of the CBD with a placard against the ANZ Bank, and he ended up in jail for contempt of court. At any event, it's also been suggested by Mr. Gawenda that we're not really at risk from having our free speech denied. No one's worrying about it. I think it's a little bit of a case of oil the squeaky wheel here, just because lots of people make a fuss when they feel their rights are impinged on. Doesn't mean the others' rights aren't impinged on as well. We would say that free speech must have primacy, and it's a democratic right that's been regarded as of the first importance in the common law for many years. George Orwell famously said, if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. Indeed, we suggest that there is greater importance to free speech than there is to the need not to insult or offend others, even minority groups, even in a community, a multicultural, multi-faith community. And that there does, of course, need to be some protective legislation, but restraint is required for the passage of laws which trammel upon the expression of opinion, belief or dogma, even though that expression of opinion, belief or dogma may be offensive or insulting to targeted minority groups or groups with protected attributes. So there is a necessary tension between free speech and protection from hate speech and vilification. But looked at another way, there is a mutuality of purpose in protecting our human rights, which value freedom of thought and freedom of expression and political communication. It is proper to draw a line in the sand by treating only truly hate speech as unlawful, using statutory language that sets the bar high before intervention by courts and tribunals. Offensive and insulting speech would not rise above that bar, but speech which truly humiliates, debases, intimidates, or incites hatred or contempt is such a serious incursion on the free expression and free thought of others, of the targets of that speech, that there is a basis for the law stepping in. And so, of course, there'll be a wide variety of responses to discriminatory speech, and even speech which is alleged to be humiliating or hateful or intimidating or vilifying of others has to be subject to some degree of objective assessment. It can't be judged only by reference to the subjective experience of the targets of that speech. Otherwise, the line can become blurred. And so one person's experience of taking modest offence is another person's perhaps abject humiliation. And so there is a need for an objective assessment. And often political and judicial debate has been around whose objective assessment that should be. Protection from hateful vilification would risk being rendered negligible if the target group's experience was not part of that process, no part of the valid measure of that. And so minority groups are only too used to having others speak for them. They need to be part of the group who are entitled to have the experience of offence and to be taken into account in determining whether speech is truly intimidating and hateful. So statutory protection is needed, but it's needed only over that high bar. It is best achieved in two ways. First, through very precise language about the words in the enacting legislation, which gives rise to a bar to speech which causes serious hatred or humiliation or contempt. Offend and insult would not be words that would have any part to play in that kind of definition. Secondly, through the enacting of defences which spell out with precision the good faith exemptions, so as to ensure that those who are truly minded to incite hatred of minorities or target groups aren't able to cloak their true purpose behind a veneer of respectability. So appropriately qualified good faith exemptions guard against dampening meaningful dialogue and stimulation of ideas within a pluralist society. None of these things are bulletproof, and obviously there will always be litigation aimed at pushing the boundaries one way or another. Anti-discrimination law is not alone in that regard, but restricting legislation to truly hateful speech of serious import may still leave leeway for some casual racism or casual sexism and homophobic utterances, and it would certainly leave leeway for challenging political and religious stimulating debate. But as a society, we need to show a degree of resilience. Too often it's been said we are a nanny state, and the liberalist value places importance on free speech and free thought and stands against it being eroded. If we want to preserve a true democracy, we must allow the ill-informed, the ill-mannered and even the spiteful to have their say, whilst still preserving social harmony and cohesion by only outlawing really serious, potentially damaging hatred and vilification of target groups. I'll just finish by saying, on my way out here in the car on the freeway, I was listening to Radio National, and there was a discussion about how you do small talk. How do you do small talk? People were ringing, never talk about religion or politics in small talk. No-go zone. And I thought to myself, how boring would it be if no one ever talked about religion or politics? And in fact, some of the most interesting debates are around those aspects that divide our thought and our ideas. So it's one thing to hate an idea or a thought or a belief. It's another thing to hate a person just because of their race or their gender or their sexuality. There's a very big difference. And we're in favour of free dissemination of ideas and thought. And so I'll now introduce the next speaker for the negative.
you, Ms Dixon. I will now call upon the second speaker for the negative, Mr James Beavers. James Beavers is a science law student here at Monash University. James won, I presume with others, the World University Debating Championships in 2013, clinching the title for the third consecutive time in 3 years for Monash University. That really is a truly spectacular run, of which those concerned should be seriously proud. He also represented Monash University at the Australian National Jest Moot earlier this year and was successful in reaching the semi-finals of that event, and I know how hotly those events are contested. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr James Beavers.
Oh God, look at the screen.
Why that photo?
Would you call it insulting or offending?
So it's a fantastic sign of the, I guess, breadth of opinions that I will be presenting the fourth new and completely inconsistent philosophical framework. I'm going to advance really three issues in the speech. The first is why the bar needs to be set at this level, and that's going to primarily deal with what James wanted to advance. The second is why this kind of social discourse, why we need to have a tool that regulates this sort of social discourse and the challenge of power structures, and that will hopefully deal mostly with Tim's analysis. And the third is going to be a discussion of why speech is not absolute, no one thinks it's absolute, and why insisting that it is meaningfully erodes the quality of political discussion in our community. Why is it this level important? James said that offending and insulting would potentially cast too broad a net. It would open the floodgates too much. And the problem with that analysis is it ignores that this kind of speech doesn't just pose an individual harm. The damage of racism is not that it subjects an individual person, it is that it creates a structure within society whereby classes of people are subjugated. And the reason that offending and insulting language is necessary is because that is the broadest spectrum. That is the language that allows a community to change its mind. When there are lots of views, when Andrew Bolt is still the most widely read columnist in Australia, and he is allowed to dictate the attitudes of people towards fair-skinned Indigenous people, that's the kind of damaging speech that we want to stamp out here, because an act that Jane would propose wouldn't go far enough. It would treat this as an issue of individual conflicts and obfuscate the social structure that underpins it. That's why the act needs to be offend or stop. But then Jane wanted to say that the nanny state was a justification. And that kind of really gets to the heart of the objections of the other side. By playing to emotive reasoning, the idea of a nanny state is great rhetoric, but it doesn't really mean a lot. The state has a meaningful role in protecting its citizens on a plethora of different issues, from their physical safety, to their economic flourishing, to their ability to exist in the community and live a life where they don't feel like they're excluded from their other citizens. But the final thing, and the thing that really upset me most, I think, about Jane's speech, was the idea that small talk was important here, and that talk would be boring if we couldn't discuss these things. People's identities and their lived experiences aren't playthings for people that can't experience racial vilification, or can't experience sexual harassment, or can't experience discrimination on the basis of sexuality. But even if that was a position we should tolerate, the fact that acts like 18C allow for private discussion means that Jane's dinner party will probably still be safe. So let's turn now to social discourse and the concern and the issues that Tim had. Tim's first issue was that you couldn't address subjectivity, and the idea that offence was subjective meant we would have no real way of assessing this. The first thing to note is that legislation that attempts to crack down on these problems frequently use the objective test. And if Tim has a problem with courts trying to step into some kind of objective position, he probably has a huge problem with the entire legal framework. And it might just be because of the quality of my legal education here, but I happen to think judges do a pretty good job of assessing torts like negligence, where courts decide on a standard of behaviour that is acceptable across the community and that individuals are called upon to meet across a range of ways. Courts are capable of assessing reasonable standards. They do so all the time. But then Tim's speech got good and interesting when he talked about, better and interesting, when he talked about the ability to critique power structures and the effect it would have on other disadvantaged minorities. And he wanted to break that down by saying that members of the LGBTIQ community and differently abled people couldn't respond to criticism. There's a couple of problems with that. The First is that is, on a favourable interpretation for my case, an argument for more legislation. It is an argument that empowers more disadvantaged minorities to feel as if they can seek recourse to the law to make sure that they are not meaningfully excluded from society. So that's not really an argument for Tim, that just exists in the middle of the ground. But thirdly, is it really true that you can't respond to criticism on the basis of your sexuality without using a racial slur? Is it really true that you cannot criticise religions that say you are not a valid person without then resorting to a baseline attack? I can't understand why it is necessary to invoke some kind of demonisation in language when you can quite effectively demonstrate that most bigoted beliefs are not effective and are offensive. So it's important to understand that it's not as if these communities are meaningfully prevented from shutting down these kind of offences. But then the third thing Tim said was that you need this to challenge authority, and he said that the main two areas for this were the race power and Galileo and Game of Thrones. So, the first thing about the race power, and I know this is getting nitpicky and is generally considered poor debating technique, but the race power itself is up for a huge amount of political discussion, and there have been moves to suggest that it will be abolished in the near future. So leaning on that isn't exactly a great crutch for him to go on. But to talk about Galileo, I can think of a few differences between theocratic papal states in Australia, so I don't think the idea of religious criticism is really one that bears a lot of weight. And critically, the provisions that we're talking about aren't tools that governments use to shut down discussion. They aren't proceedings brought by agents of the state. They are individual things. They are things that are brought by peak bodies for various disadvantaged groups. They are things that are brought by representatives and class actions. So they're very individualised methods. If anything, they empower the individual to stand up and take ownership and fight against this kind of language that puts them in a worse position in society. So in that way, these kinds of acts don't prevent criticism of power structures. I don't understand why you need to use racially charged language to criticise policies of the government. There's a number of ways that you can do that. The point is that this is about stamping out community attitude. So let's move now to why speech is not absolute. And it's important that Tim wanted to characterise this idea as there is this presumption of free speech, that the kind of baseline that we go about society in is just that we assume speech is true. That is absolutely ridiculous. The idea that we just assume we have free speech and it extends across a range of areas is just simply not true. Why? We intrude on free speech through a number of other rights that we consider important. So, through various things, contractual rights and legal obligations in terms of confidential information that you can't disclose. In terms of property, in that you can't use copyrighted information or trademarks to communicate an idea in a special way that would be quite effective. In terms of economic rights, we prioritise people's personal reputations in the tort of defamation, and we curtail the right of protest to make sure that people can access their work. In terms of threats, in terms of personal safety, where threats to someone's safety are prohibited, but also negligent statements, like the fire in the theatre that might endanger someone's safety, are also prohibited. And finally, we do that to protect broader interests of democracy, so donations to political parties are extremely heavily regulated. So in all those ways, we place value judgments on where speech is allowed to intrude. And you can quite clearly see that there's a whole spectrum of areas where we say that speech is not important and that speech is secondary. So that clearly identifies there is a protective role for the state. And why should people's identities and experiences be outside of that role? Why is it true that someone's ability to act in the state in the way they wish to is not a role for the state to protect? Because critically, the understandings of how we've shaped a state are not value-free. They are not objective. The way we have constructed most liberal democracies has been from a period of European enlightenment. And European nations people who make up European nations generally have not had to experience racism. They have not had to experience, given the majority of political figures that originally shaped democratic institutions were men, they did not experience sexism. They did not experience discriminations on a wide range of axes. So in those ways, it is not true to say that we have an objective and value-free society. The role in liberal democratic societies already protects the interests of people like me quite well, because I don't experience discrimination in any of those ways. I don't need that additional protection. But assuming that my experience is the only one that other people have is farcical, because other people do not enjoy the same privileges of culture and society as I do. And that is why the state needs to step in more, because this language alienates you from your society. It's very similar to the kinds of terms of harassment that Tim thought was speech. What is the distinction between this and harassment? Racist language does not make you feel like you are part of a community. It makes you feel like you are unsafe. It makes you feel like people do not think you are welcome and might feel that you are a target of violence or don't deserve to be employed at the same standard, or any number of other racialized harms. So in those ways, there needs to be this legislation to ensure baseline access to society. But even then, the way we approach speech is important, because we don't just value talking. Speech is important instrumentally. The right to speech is important for political contributions. And this kind of language that we talk about means you lose the voices of prominent commentators from those reasons. Why? It means because if you are about to write your opinion and you know that there is that racialized backlash and you've been exposed to that language before, there might be hostility to what you say. You feel as if your contribution might not be valued, so there's less of an incentive for you to produce it. The second is that you also have to weigh up the tides of personal abuse that you will suffer. So when writers like Anita Sarkeesian and Zoe Quinn and other feminist critics on Twitter are exposed to women calling them whores and sluts, they withdraw from that public discussion. And you need these kinds of tools to prevent that withdrawal, because their voice is valuable. The third thing is that it disincentivizes publishers from taking those critiquing voices on as well, because those publishers are also subjected to various forms of vitriol and backlash for taking on writers that express these kind of contrary views. And that means that the ability to access platforms to put out your view more widely is also curtailed. So in all those ways, if you actually care about the political value of speech, not only do you not need to use racist or sexist or homophobic words to challenge structures of authority or to challenge the government, but if you allow other people to do that, you lose the most prominent and effective minority critiques of those structures. That's why this legislation is important, and that's why it has to stand.
Thank you, Mr. Vedas, and we have learned something else. Apart from things about Games of Thrones, we know that younger people speak much faster than those. I would now ask the third, and also finished on time. I will now ask the third and final speaker for the affirmative, Mr. Chris Berg, to take the floor. Chris Berg is one of Australia's most passionate voices for free markets and individual liberty. He's the Policy Director at the Institute of Public Affairs, a regular columnist with ABC's The Drum, award-winning former editor of the IPA Review. He's the author of 2 books and has edited 2 others. His latest book in defence of freedom of speech, From Ancient Greece to Andrew Bolt, an interesting juxtaposition, was published in 2012. Chris.
It's nice to have a discussion so far without actually talking about what Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act actually says. Section 18C makes it unlawful, so you can sue someone for this, to offend, insult, humiliate, and intimidate someone on the basis of their racial, ethnic, national origins. There are 4 words in there: offend, insult, humiliate, and intimidate. Now, the government's bill, or the government's exposure draft bill, which was so controversial and which Michael correctly pointed out, excited a very large section of the community, was about all 4 words. It was going to get rid of all 4 words effectively. This debate isn't about all 4 words. This debate is about offend and insult. Now, Michael understands that, and so which is why he tried to claim that offence is pretty much a synonym of intimidate. So, okay, well, I'm with him. Let's get rid of the words offend and insult and let intimidate carry the plain English meaning of the word. But anyway, I don't have to worry too much about Michael, because really he agrees with us that it shouldn't be unlawful for things to be unlawful, that Section 18C makes unlawful, so he's on a unity ticket there and he's welcome to sit in my chair anytime. James. You threw a lot of things out there. I can't possibly respond to 3% of them. I think, if I followed it, he would like unelected judges, and embrace this fact, to decide the terms on which we debate in a democracy. I quite like the fact that he referred to an objective test for offence. I like that because that's the way the lawyers refer to it, an objective test. Who couldn't disagree with an objective test? But it doesn't mean objective in the way you and I, and presumably some of the lawyers who aren't in this room, would call it. The objective test works like this. Judges imagine a hypothetical, ordinary, reasonable member of the community, and they then imagine what that hypothetical, ordinary, reasonable member would think. That's it. That's the objective test that judges apply to these cases. Then he listed a lot of laws that aren't at all the subject of the debate. I think I've picked up political party funding in there. I don't know what that has to do with offence. Perhaps it was in there somewhere, and I apologise if I missed it. But nevertheless, my claim today is that the case we have made is not a contrarian or controversial one. It is quite the opposite. It is the consensus intellectual position shared by the vast majority of human rights experts and free speech advocates on both sides of the political spectrum. It was the consensus intellectual position at the time of the first debates about Section 18C, when the racial hatred bill was being debated in the mid-1990s. It was the position of the Australian United Nations delegates when the 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which originally included the prohibition against incitement to racial discrimination, we opposed that on the grounds that, quote, people cannot be legislated into morality. I'm going to go through a couple of supporters of our position briefly. Robert Mann, the famous social democratic commentator, criticised Section 18C like this. Before reading this bill, I had assumed that the tradition of free speech ran so deep in this country that it was unconceivable that any Australian Parliament would pass such a thing. David Marr, more recently, said, hurt feelings should never attract the law, as they do now. Offence and insults are everyday reality of free discourse. Sarah Joseph, Professor of Human Rights and one of the most prominent commentators on this issue, prohibitions on speech which offend and insult even on the basis of race, go too far. Tim's boss, Gillian Triggs, the head of the Human Rights Commission, so even more of an authority on human rights than Tim, said there is a genuine community concern that the words offend and insult put the threshold at too low a level. Jim Spiegelman, the former Chief Justice of the New South Wales. Anyway, I could keep going on. I don't obviously need to cite conservative and liberal supporters of removing this. Let's take that as read. My purpose here is not to appeal to authority. It is, however, to point out that the idea that the government has no role deciding what is offensive or insulting has always been the driving force behind the battle against censorship in history. Books were once banned because they were offensive or insulting. Films were once banned because they were offensive or insulting. Our argument is the same argument that ties together the fight against censorship of comics and cartoons, of the battles to repeal blasphemy and obscenity laws, even to end political censorship. This has very little to do with Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act. That is not the question. Should we allow speech that offends or insults? And Australia, unfortunately, has many unjustifiable laws that prohibit offence. There are, for instance, anti-swearing laws, mostly at the state level. These are justified on nothing other than traditional obscenity grounds. In practice, however, they disproportionately punish poor, Indigenous and disadvantaged Australians. Once, the Australian government banned Lady Chatterley's Lover. Now it bans a gay film from being shown at a film festival on exactly the same grounds, that it is too offensive, that it is a violation of community standards. To the extent you consider yourself a supporter of freedom of speech at all, you should be opposed to such laws. David Marr, again, defending, this time, the photographs published by the artist Bill Henson in 2009 said, in a free and energetic society, giving offence is necessary. It happens and must happen all the time. Your sensitivity does not veto my right to speak, or write, or make a film, or indeed exhibit a crucifix immersed in urine. The reference there, for many who probably have no idea what I was talking about, there is To Piss Christ, an artwork exhibited briefly in Australia in 1997 before it was attacked by someone who had been offended by it with a hammer. Now, the most eloquent and comprehensive defence of hate speech laws in recent years was done by a philosopher named Jeremy Waldron. He published a book called the harm in hate speech. She's articulated, in my view, the best argument, the best human dignity argument for limiting extreme expression. It's really the argument that the negative side are trying to run today. But here's the rub. Even for Jeremy Waldron, the primary case for hate speech laws, he argues that offensive and insulting speech does not meet any sane threshold in a democratic society and ought not to be regulated. Blasphemy should be lawful, offence should be lawful. There is hate speech and there is offensive speech, and there is a great chasm between the two. A society that constrains speech attacks our freedom of thought. It makes a mockery of our democratic principles. The topic today is whether we should allow speech that offends or insults. It is very easy to mouth platitudes about supporting free speech. But if we do not support speech that is offensive or insulting, we do not support it at all.
Thank you, Chris. And it is now my pleasure to call upon this evening's final speaker, the enviable and unenviable position of the final speaker, Ms. Claire O'Neill MP. Claire O'Neill is the federal member for Hotham. She's a passionate advocate for her community, cares strongly about a positive plan for Australia. She holds a double degree in Arts and Laws from Monash University. Also attended Harvard as a Fulbright Scholar, where she graduated with a Master of Public Policy. She's the former mayor of the city of Greater Dandenong, and indeed was, I'm led to understand, the youngest female mayor in Australian history. Ladies and gentlemen, for the negative and the final speaker of the evening, Claire O'Neill.
In March earlier this year, the Attorney General George Brandis rose in the Senate and made this now infamous statement that people do have the right to be bigots. The following day, a woman arrived at my electorate office in Clayton Road, just down the road from here, and she was visibly shaken. She was a very sensible woman, a mother, and she had been walking down Clayton Road and she'd accidentally blocked the path of 3 men walking behind her. And the men began to racially abuse her. She turned around and tried to object to their language, and they said to her, "We're allowed to do this now because of George Brandis." As a community, we set and maintain standards of behaviour, and we do it through rules, through laws, and through codes. And the first point I want to reiterate that Michael and James and I have talked about today is this. We should not allow some speech that offends and insults, because in a decent society, it is simply the case that some things should not be said. And in having the discussion and making the decision about what sits in and out of the range of acceptable behaviour, we define and we describe and we create the kind of society that we want to live in. When we change those laws and when we change those rules, we also change society, and that can happen with immediate impacts. Now, we've talked quite a little bit tonight about racism, and the subject of tonight's speech is not specifically about that, but I think there's 2 important reasons why it keeps coming up in this conversation. One is that I think it's an area where we can very plainly see that when we change standards, when we allow speech that offends and insults, we do tear down some of what are, in some instances, fragile norms that hold our society together and dictate how we treat one another. But I think it is also the area where I observe the biggest, the widest, the deepest chasm between the opinion pieces that are written in ivory towers in very fancy universities like this one, and the lived experience of people on the street who are the people who these laws are designed to protect. I represent one of the most multicultural communities in Australia, and the reality is that a lot of the people that I represent came to Australia to escape oppressive regimes. Some of those regimes were racist, some of those regimes were genocidal. I represent people who lived through the Holocaust. I represent a large number of people who escaped from apartheid South Africa. To these Australians, being offended and insulted because of the colour of their skin is not a theory and an idea. It's not an theory and an idea like it is for the people who have argued for the affirmative today. We heard some very theoretical things. We've heard about George Orwell. We've talked about democratic theories. We've heard about a lot of ideologies. Even Galileo has now come up twice, strangely. We've talked about critiquing power structures. We've even heard about something that I haven't heard before called consensus intellectual position. I can't think of anything more elitist. I can't absolutely believe it. Here and say, no, I'm serious. I can't believe that. Because the truth is that the people who these laws are designed to protect are not going to write op-eds that get published in The Australian. They are people who are walking up and down the street in Clayton Road, a lot of the people that I represent. If we allow speech that offends and insults, these are the people that pay the price. It's not the people who have sat on the panel tonight and talked about these issues. So when we talk about whether we should allow speech that offends and insults, I actually don't think that we should be talking about Galileo and George Orwell. I think we should be talking about the people who these laws actually affect, whether they feel safe when they walk up and down the street. That is just the reality. These are laws that affect the memories that these people have about family members being incarcerated or killed because of their race. There are people who live in this very community who feel fear when they walk past large groups of people in the park. These are the things we should be thinking about, not arcane theories that we can read about in the libraries all over this university. So for these people, as I think Michael talked about very eloquently, having a law that means that certain speech that offends and insults shouldn't be allowed, it codifies the outrage that we should feel as members of the community and set standards, as I say, as to how we treat one another. Now, I want to talk through some of the arguments that we heard. I think from all three of the speakers on the affirmative, we heard that offending and insulting is subjective, and it's impossible to take offence. It's impossible to take offence. It's possible to take offence, but not to give offence. I haven't heard that one before, so there you go. I think that just shows, number one, a staggering kind of lack of faith in the legal system that we have in Australia, and number two, a staggering lack of knowledge about how the legal system actually works, which is a bit strange coming from this panel. But the truth is that the law all the time makes decisions and judgments about what is reasonable. All of us, many of us in this room, are law students, and one of the things we do is talk ad nauseum about the reasonable person test. This is a judgment about what a person should feel when they hear or receive some certain types of information. Now, the way that the Racial Discrimination Act is a very living and breathing example of courts' ability to make very sane and reasonable judgments about how people should feel about certain things. So, for example, the case law around the Racial Discrimination Act has made pronouncements that mere slights, for example, cannot be taken action against under the Racial Discrimination Act. Now, we also heard that the law can't be applied consistently. So why should things like racist language be protected when we have all these other types of offensive things that are not being protected against? As a related argument, I think we heard from Tim that there are a lot of problems in society, so why are we trying to legislate to fix just one of them? Again, maybe I misunderstood there. We heard a couple of things. Jane talked about people making a fuss, the squeaky wheel. Why is this problem getting a lot of attention? There seems to be, I think, a feeling that there's an unnecessary focus on race from those who are on the affirmative. The truth is that lots of laws are consistently applied, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have laws altogether. We can't catch every criminal, but we should still have laws that outlaw criminal behaviour. And indeed, we cannot outlaw all types of criminality, but again, we should still have laws. Just because it doesn't seem possible to stamp out all forms of injustice, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to stamp out the forms of injustice that we can see and that we can deal with through the law. We also heard from the affirmative that offending and insulting is simply too low a bar. I don't think it's probably beyond the intellectual realms of everyone in this room to understand that there are rights and they compete with one another. We can't enjoy them all fully, so we have to strike a balance. And there is this legitimate question about where should we put the bar? Is offending and insulting at the right place? Now, I don't think that anyone on this negative side of the debate today has argued that all speech that offends and insults anyone should be outlawed. But we do believe that there are certain types of speech that offend and insult that should be made unlawful. And I think the examples that we've drawn on are ones where we see that there's a very important community value that is being protected. So things like living in a feminist or egalitarian society between men and women. So we think that there are restrictions around what you can say about women and sexualising women. Race is another one that's come up a lot. So I think there's lots of good examples where we can see that competing rights need to be prioritised in some areas of law. The other thing I would say though is there are lots of exceptions, and when we come back again to 18C, what I believe to be a very well constructed, positive law, we know that, for example, there's a fair comment defence. So you can say something offensive and insulting, but as long as you're doing it in a good spirit and trying to participate in a good public debate, then you're allowed to make those comments, you're allowed to make those offensive comments. All it requires is that the speaker or the person making those comments was acting reasonably, that they were telling the truth and making comments based on fact. What we knew in the Andrew Bolt case, if you look at the decision that was made in the Andrew Bolt case, is that it wasn't the offensive and insulting speech that Andrew Bolt made that really took him down. It was the fact that there were massive errors of fact in the things that he said about the fair-skinned Aborigines that he insulted. It was the fact that his comments were so malicious in the way that they were expressed that he wasn't able to get through the fair comment test. Now perhaps if Andrew Bolt had been more reasonable in his comments, then he wouldn't have fallen foul of 18C. Now I opened by talking about some of the impacts of what I see as offensive and insulting speech on the shape of our community. I want you all to cast your mind back to 2005, where there were a series of racially motivated crimes, at least that's how they were reported, in Sydney. Some weeks later, 5,000 people gathered at Cronulla Beach and a race riot ensued right here in our own country. Now before that happened, a lot of us probably would never have believed it was possible to happen in Australia. I don't think that I could have believed it before it happened before my very eyes. And I just made that point to say that the way that our society is constructed is sometimes a lot more fragile than we wanted to believe it to be. And when we have laws that set standards of behaviour, we're protecting and we're bolstering the way that we want people to treat one another in our community. That's why we've argued tonight that some speech that offends and insults should be unlawful.
Now, let me add on behalf of the audience my thanks to all our speakers this evening. It is great, and you're going to stop for a moment, stop reading the funny tweets. And let me say this. They have given of their time. They have, I suspect, apart from the one actual student in the room, gone back into that feeling of love for the things that you do as a student, in which you are part of debates, in which you come and air your opinions, shape your opinions to elucidate a particularly thought-provoking question. Because as we know, what people say here is part of speaking to a particular side of a debate, and it is in those ritualised forms, that we actually expose ourselves to how we might understand something, and we are provoked in our thought. We think, we hope, more deeply about a subject. We get a bit of amusement on the way, which is a great thing. And so I'd like us all to thank again the speakers who have given us questions, and I am going to hand over to the audience and to Shara. I think am I calling out people from the audience, or is it you? Oh no, it's fallen to me. So there are questions. There are people from the society with microphones, and there are questions to the panel. I guess we might start here, and then I'll go on the back.
A question for the affirmative team. Which speech is more important to defend? The racist insults this law bans, or the speech of minority commentators who are so hurt by these insults that they feel they cannot make their legitimate political contribution?
Okay. There are two ways to think about constraints on freedom of speech. There's formal and informal ones. So a formal one is a law. A informal one is what you suggest. You feel that there's a chilling effect and so on and so forth. Now, I don't think anybody on this table would disagree that the way you feel that society may receive you or the way that society already has received you affects the way you speak, or what you can feel that you can and can't say. I mean, we're all doing that. We're all regulating our speech because we know how society might respond. But you cannot protect freedom of speech by eliminating or lowering the threshold under which formal speech can be approached. You've got two tiers, basically. We want to encourage more people to speak. We want to encourage greater community involvement with speech. But if we feel